In this video, I turn to the third and final component of the sociology of climate change, societal responses. My discussion of impacts was, unavoidably, pretty bleak. This survey of the variety of responses will, I think, end up showing a more complex picture. Some disheartening responses, yes, but also some encouraging ones. So, on to the topic of responses. Here you see a list of all the different kinds of responses I will be describing. First, doing science is one kind of societal response. Science, in the first place, is a process of discovery. Not that long ago, people believed in what you might call a steady state Earth. The planet had always been the same continents, same weather, same ecosystems, same plants and animals. Then, slowly, over time, scientists discovered facts that supported a fundamentally different story, a story of change, species evolving, species going extinct, continents moving, tropical Earth and Ice Age Earth. Climate change was discovered. Hand in hand with that discovery came the understanding that in our era, climate change is no longer a, quote, natural process driven by, say, volcanism or variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun. It was discovered that in today's world, it is human activity that is driving climate change. And scientists never just discover, they also communicate their findings to others, to fellow scientists, certainly, but also to fellow citizens. And when what is being found is potentially catastrophic, informing fellow citizens becomes quite urgent. Some climate scientists have gotten so concerned that they have felt called to go beyond just communicating. They have, however reluctantly, felt they had to become political activists. This is James Hansen, who was the first scientist to testify in Congress about climate change. That was back in 1989, 32 years ago. Now, frustrated at the slow pace of response, James Hansen is in the street, protesting, getting arrested. The next two responses are opposites, locked in conflict, climate activism and climate denial. Is climate change real? Is it being caused by people? Or is it just the Earth doing its thing, as it always has? Is it serious? Movement and counter-movement struggle to shape society's perceptions. Sociologists have long been interested in social movements. Let's start then with the climate movement. That movement is, today, complex, multifaceted, increasingly energized and visible. Every one of the older, more established American environmental organizations now says that climate is a top priority for them. And there are new organizations that focus exclusively on climate activism. Of those, the best known are 350.org and the Citizens Climate Lobby. The climate justice movement focuses attention on the ways that climate change is disproportionately impacting the poor and people of color. Climate activism has been energized by a younger cohort of activists, college students, high school, and middle school students. Greta Thunberg has emerged as the face and the voice of this new generation. This younger generation of activists have formed new organizations. Thunberg's School Strike for Climate, the Student Strike for Climate Action, the Sunrise Movement, and the most militant of them all, Extinction Rebellion. On the other side of the issue, a well-funded, well-organized, highly visible counter-movement that tries to convince the public that climate change is not happening. Or, well, It is happening, but it's not caused by anything people are doing. It's just nature. The climate has always been changing, so there's nothing to be done. Or saying that doing anything about it would hurt the economy. We now know that climate denial started, unsurprisingly, with the fossil fuel industry itself. For example, ExxonMobil's own scientists were telling their bosses decades ago that burning fossil fuel would cause climate change, but Exxon kept those findings hidden. And it started funding climate denial. Then, even larger sums of money started coming in from trusts funded by ultra-conservative billionaires, such as the Koch brothers Foundation and the Donors Trust, owned by the Mercers, father and daughter. Their money flowed to conservative foundations funding denialist activities, and then the denialist message was broadcast far and wide. By Fox News, certainly. Also by a nationwide network of right-wing talk radio stations. By Rush Limbaugh, of course, but also many others. By the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And by many Republican politicians. Here is Senator James Inhofe telling fellow senators that snow is still falling in Washington, D.C., proof that climate change isn't happening. There are whole websites dedicated to nothing but climate denial. And one can easily find many denialist videos on YouTube. As we discuss other societal responses, this polarization, this opposition between belief and denial, will appear again and again. Let's consider, next, responses from the private sector. Until recently, every sector of the fossil fuel industry actively denied that climate change is real. Some giants in the oil industry now acknowledge that climate change is real, and they are claiming to have started being part of the solution. Some are diversifying into renewables. Others have been slower to begin this transition away from fossil fuels. Pressure on them is building. Pressure from environmentalists, from pension funds and other activist stockholders. Pressure from the International Energy Agency, the IEA, suddenly agreeing, declaring that the world must go net zero by 2050. How real is this transition, this acceptance of the need to change? Somewhat real, but much of the industry still wants to pump, refine, and burn fossil fuel. Their view is, as you see here, the world still needs oil and gas, and governments should focus on mitigating global warming using technologies such as carbon capture and storage, instead of attacking fossil fuels. The really significant shift toward taking climate change seriously comes from other actors in the private sector. In fact, from some of the biggest and most powerful actors: insurance, finance, automakers. Why insurance? Climate-driven natural disasters are now starting to cause tens of billions of dollars of damage every year. Those numbers have been rising inexorably every year. That's a concern for companies that insure those losses. Losses from larger, more powerful, more damaging hurricanes, for example. Losses from fire. Look at this trend. Insurance payouts for wildfire damage just in California. Big financial investors are worried too. Look at this statement from 415 investors who represent over $32 trillion in assets. They say, "We reiterate our full support for the Paris Agreement and strongly urge all governments to implement the actions that are needed to achieve the goals of the agreement with the utmost urgency." And look at this statement from the World Economic Forum, the annual meeting of the world's richest, most powerful people in Davos, Switzerland. The 2019 Davos statement declares that extreme weather and climate change are the first and second highest risks to the world's economy. Look at that last line. Of all risks, it is in relation to the environment that the world is most clearly sleepwalking into catastrophe. And pretty much every car maker in the world is rushing to transition to a future with electric cars. In the US, Ford and General Motors. In Japan, Honda, Toyota, Nissan, Mazda, Mitsubishi, and so on. In sum, the loudest voices in the private sector used to be denialist voices, but that is no longer true today. Turning now to another category of societal response, this from civil society actors. Sociologists define civil society actors as organizations or institutions that are not part of the private economy and not part of government. Can we identify responses from significant elements of civil society? We have already discussed the segment of civil society that is most directly engaged, environmental organizations, climate activists. There is one other sector of civil society that needs to be discussed. I'm talking about faith communities or organized religion. Here again we see both pro and con, both for and against. The older so-called mainline Protestant churches, such as the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Lutheran churches, the Episcopal Church, tend to be liberal on divisive culture war issues, such as abortion, women's rights, gay rights, and racial equality. And they accept the findings of modern science, so that's not standing in the way of their position on environmental issues. For these faith communities, protecting the environment, God's creation, is seen now as a vital part of their faith. Looking at just one of these more liberal Protestant churches, the Methodist Church, its most recent efforts include setting the goal that the church as a whole will achieve net zero emissions by 2050, selling off its stock holdings in Shell Oil because Shell isn't doing enough about climate change, and organizing a new youth-led campaign, so-called Climate Justice for All campaign, to mobilize the global Methodist family to take action on the climate crisis. Politically conservative Protestant faith communities, such as the Southern Baptists and Evangelicals, are committed to climate denial. A few decades ago, such faith communities did support environmental protection, with rhetoric about the need to be good stewards of God's creation. But more recently, for a variety of reasons, some theological and some secular and political, they have made common cause with other climate deniers in American society. In 2006, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops created what's known as the Catholic Climate Covenant to better spread the message that the Church wanted its adherents to care about and to do something about climate change. Pope Francis has spoken forcefully about the Church's continuing commitment to protecting the environment. For instance, in his famous encyclical Laudato Si on the care of our common home. Sociologists have also been interested in understanding how media shapes people's understanding of and opinions about social problems. Media coverage shapes the public's perception of climate change. In the internet age, the age of websites, YouTube, blogging, and social media, we need to split this discussion into two, looking first at older media, network television, newspapers, and then at the situation online. Starting with traditional media, coverage in traditional media, such as on the three major networks, used to vary greatly. Coverage would peak following some major event, an important international conference, the release of the film An Inconvenient Truth. Then, coverage would decrease. Although it's not shown on this slide, coverage rose again following the international climate talks in Paris in 2015. Coverage, both in print media and on television, has been much more constant and much more prominent in recent years. That increase in coverage has been driven, in part, by the growing frequency of extreme weather events, big hurricanes, massive fires in the American West, flooding in the Midwest, stories that are characterized by dramatic visuals and compelling stories of human suffering. It's important to note that such events are no longer treated just as personal tragedies, but are routinely described as the effects of climate change. I turn now to the internet, to websites, blogs, and social media. As I noted earlier, there's tons of denialist content online. Leading denialists have their own websites. There are many denialist videos on YouTube. On the other hand, websites such as Climate Central, Inside Climate News, DSmog Blog offer the viewer sound information on climate science. YouTube also has excellent science videos. Here is one featuring Katharine Hayhoe, currently the Nature Conservancy's top climate scientist. YouTube has more rousing content too. Here, Bill Nye, the science guy, figuratively burns climate deniers by literally burning the kind of toy globe one finds in many kids' bedrooms. And here is Little Dickie's pro-climate love letter to the Earth. This slide is out of date. It says the video has been viewed over 150 million times. Right now, in June of 2021, the actual current number is 315 million views. As with so many politically charged issues, the internet is a mixed bag when it comes to climate change. It can serve to deepen the public's understanding of and concern about climate change, but it also provides the technological infrastructure for broadcasting torrents of anti-environmentalist propaganda. Now, what about that general, diffuse societal reaction that we call public opinion? Let's take a look at a series of Gallup polls. They tell us that 2/3 of the public now believes that global warming is caused by human action. On the other hand, less than half say they worry a great deal about it or believe that it will pose a serious threat to them during their lifetime. Drilling deeper into the demographics, we can see that those aggregate numbers hide significant differences. Women are more concerned than men. Young Americans are more concerned than older Americans. People of color are more concerned than non-Hispanic whites. The greatest gap is between Democrats and Republicans. 77% of Democrats are, quote, concerned believers, as compared to only 16% of Republicans. Such numbers reveal that the American public is deeply divided, deeply polarized. Policy, formal government laws, regulations, treaties, agreements are another category of societal response. At all levels, international, national, state, and local. At the international level, the world's nations signed their first climate treaty in Kyoto more than 20 years ago. That agreement was weak, but a step forward, at least in principle. It was further weakened when the United States, at the time the greatest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, failed to ratify it. But diplomats kept at it, meeting every year, and they reached a substantial new accord in Paris in 2015. The nations agreed to the principle of keeping global warming, quote, well below 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The world's leaders celebrated, but then, a few years later, the U.S. declared it would leave the Paris Accords, threatening the entire agreement. In 2021, with a new president in the White House, the U.S. declared it would rejoin the Paris Accords. Looking at all the other nations in the global community, one can say at this point that progress has been uneven. Some governments have committed their nations to steady decarbonization with the goal of reaching zero emissions by 2050. Other nations are lagging. Overall, there has been some real progress as climate impacts have become ever more evident and frightening. But as of 2021, it has to be said, many nations are not yet on track to fulfill their commitments under the Paris Accords. An honest assessment of all nations' current commitments and current actions suggests that reaching the Accord's goal of keeping the world well below 2 degrees Celsius is far from assured at this point. In the U.S., progress in addressing climate change policy at the national level has been stop and go, depending on which party holds power in Washington, D.C. Climate skepticism is the default position of the Republican Party, and almost all GOP office holders have been dead set against the federal government making meaningful climate policy. Democrats have been generally more supportive, but one would have to say rather lukewarm about it. The Obama administration did try to make headway, such as here, when the president declared the goal of increasing cars and trucks' fuel efficiency. But things went into reverse during the Trump years. Trump tweeted that global warming was a Chinese hoax. And he filled leadership roles in executive branch agencies, the EPA, NOAA, Interior, the Energy Department, with climate deniers. 2021 saw another 180-degree reversal. When he took office, President Biden declared that fighting climate change would be a core theme of his administration. Not just an environmental policy narrowly defined, but more broadly across a whole spectrum of administration policies, in its infrastructure plans, in its economic recovery plans, in foreign policy. In contrast to the vacillation at the federal level, forward, then backward, then forward again, we see steady progress at the level of state and local government. The governors of about half the states, including some of the biggest, such as California and New York, are members of a climate alliance, a bipartisan coalition of governors committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Over 90 cities in the U.S., including some of our biggest cities, have adopted clean energy goals. Let's turn next to another kind of societal response, a critically important one, the development of green energy and the reimagining of urban spaces. The past few years have seen immense technological progress in developing ever more affordable ways to build wind and solar. Prices have indeed come down, but there is a long way to go. This is what wind and solar look like in the U.S. today. And this is how much wind and solar will have to be built by 2050 if the U.S. is to reach near zero carbon by then. Yes, there is a long way to go, but prices continue to drop, and that means that economically it is feasible. In addition, a lot of thought is going into other measures that will be needed, making homes and buildings more energy efficient, redesigning cities so that people are less dependent on driving their cars between home and work, between home and going shopping, between home and going out to have some fun. And finally, we get to a proposed response, one which has not yet been tried, but which society may yet have to resort to as a last desperate response: geoengineering. That is, if in some years not enough has been done, and climate change impacts have reached crisis levels, there will suddenly be immense pressure to deal with the crisis by massively re-engineering some aspect of Earth's systems. As this graphic shows, geoengineering proposals range from capturing CO2 and then burying it underground, to changing the chemistry of the oceans, to seeding the atmosphere with aerosols that reflect some sunlight back into space, to launching immense mirrors into orbit. Such ideas worry observers. The worry is that there may be serious, unforeseen, and unintended consequences if human beings try to control nature on such a massive scale. Stepping back, one would have to say at this point that society's responses have been a mix. Some responses offer hope, others are rather dispiriting. Let's try to leave, though, on a good note and recall some of the positive developments that we have seen in recent years. The science has continued to improve. Climate activism continues to rise. Powerful private sector actors are now advocating action. Important faith communities are too. There has been increasing coverage on traditional media, and there's positive trends in public opinion. Nations are increasingly implementing international agreements, and we have seen real progress at the level of states and cities, and lots of encouraging innovations in clean energy and in green technology. And that concludes my overview of the three inquiries that together make up the sociology of climate change. Let me remind you one more time that you can find more information on any of these topics here on the For Students Research Guides page of the website.